Hello, everyone. This is Kanika, and I'm back with another episode of the Insights Lounge. I'm the founder and CEO of MindCog. We offer bespoke AI-enabled market intelligence solutions. Today, we have with us Keith Hoover. Hi, Keith.
Good. Hello. How are you doing?
Very well. Thank you so much for joining us. Keith is the president of Black Swan Textiles. He has had a very long and illustrious career in the field of textiles and innovation. He's in charge of leading in digitalizing apparel and textile industries. His expertise spans from 3D product design to factory floor automation, and he's currently spearheading digital innovation and product creation at Ralph Lauren, New York. He was also previously connected with Under Armour, and he has led several multi-million-dollar textile programs across the world. So, as you can see, we have a very interesting guest with us, and the topic of today's podcast is digital innovation in the textile industry. Pete, thank you for making the time again. And to start with, just like me, I'm sure everyone who's listening to us is curious that you've worked for so many years in the world of textile and manufacturing. How has it shaped your journey in innovation and digitalization that you're working in today?
Well, a lot has changed and a lot has stayed the same, but just to quickly clear, I'm doing some consulting with Ralph Lauren at this point, but I'm not spearheading their project. However, I did start my career in the fashion industry with Ralph Lauren. And oddly enough, I started it as a fashion illustrator when digital illustration were these digits, not O's and ones. I moved into Ralph Lauren's R&D center where we developed colors and finishes for apparel. So it translated that aesthetic appreciation into executing on a commercial scale. The intent of designing a garment is to make a garment. I mean, it's and to make money from that garment. So I learned some very practical lessons in a dye house in North Carolina, working with veterans in the industry who had spent decades in developing and improving color matching processes, finishing developing processes, and eventually fabric development. So I think that starting with a brand like Ralph Lauren, which has a strong design aesthetic, high quality standard, was a good foundation.
Hmm. And from what I gather, you also led the first big digital color management program in the US. How did that sort of shape your, interest in innovation in textiles?
Well, that's true. I mean, and here again, I learned the basics at Ralph Lauren. What I had known about color, I learned primarily in art school, color theory and all that kind of stuff. However, when I went to Ralph Lauren and was working with some of the industry professionals, they started explaining color in very logical, methodical ways. And it kind of clicked because their explanation corresponded to what I had just done intuitively. So I knew that the process could work. So eventually, after Ralph Lauren, I went to Target, where we started the process of digital color approval, and the process has been around for a long time. In fact, Marks and Spencer back in the 90s probably was the first uh, retailer in the world to implement digital color, where they were approving colors strictly by the numbers. So I took what I had learned in North Carolina and talked to Chris Sargent at Marks and Spencer, and so we applied that program globally. For at that time, Target was about a $50 billion company, something like that, and that involved a lot of mills, a lot of vendors. Eventually, went on to J.C. Penney, where we, instead of just digitalizing color approval, we eliminated color approval by actually being able to look at the data that dye houses were making their decisions on. And then, dye houses use color management technology because it makes sense and it saves money. So by leveraging the technology they were already using, we eliminated a process and took 3 months out of the calendar. It gave us faster turnaround. It gave us better quality because all the mills were actually matching to the same digital standard instead of their own version of it. So it made sense. It scared a lot of people because people were used to working the old-fashioned way. In fact, we went to a mill and asked them, "Show us how you approve a production lot of color." And they pulled out a color standard, they pulled out their lab dip approval, they pulled out their production approval, they pulled out some run cards, and they sat around for about an hour trying to decide whether one production lot was acceptable or not. And we showed them by looking at one number, a delta E number, they could make a decision, and they were, ooh, even though it saved them tons of time and inefficiency, they were rather scared, not because the science doesn't work, but because of the behavior of retailers who didn't think so logically. So it ended up by looking at numbers and a logical process, we benefited the mill, we benefited the vendor, and it ultimately benefited the brand and the customer.
Yeah, yeah. I think change, I think, is always scary to begin with. And many people just resist it because it seems like it might change something that they were used to. But very interesting that you just mentioned that it not only standardized the colors, but also save a lot of time. 3 months of the calendar is a lot of time. Can you explain in simple terms, like what is the difficult part about the traditional way of working with fabrics, and how does your company currently solve these challenges?
That's a great question, and that is the big question because when you think about apparel, apparel is constructed fabric. So, and fabric is 60% of the cost of goods. So, when it comes down to it, if you solve the apparel problem, if you solve the fabric problem, then you solve the apparel problem. So, when I look at fabric, I apply it back to the way I think about color. Color can be broken down into elements of hue, lightness, and chromaticity. It can be measured. There are metrics that you can apply to measure a sample compared to a standard, all these things. So then I look at fabric and I look at the way people describe fabric, and they use marketing names, or they use numbers, or they use any number of descriptors that don't make much sense and don't apply to the manufacturing process. So the way we're looking at fabric is it first it needs to be standardized. And how do you standardize anything? You break it down into meaningful components. Think of language. Language is broken down into words, and words are broken down into letters, and letters are broken down to an alphabet. So we're building an alphabet for fabric based on the the variables that you need to know about and control when you set up in the case of knitting, when you set up a knitting machine. So we need to know about stitch density, courses in wales per inch. We need to know about the yarn, traits of the yarn, and we need to know the stitch pattern in knitting. In single knitting, there's knit, tuck, and miss stitches, and there's combinations of those, and those fall into repeat patterns. So it's actually, when you look at fabric like a knitter looks at fabric, then it's pretty
Mm,
simple because circular knitting machines have been around for over 100 years. Not much has changed with them.
mm,
So we know a lot about knit construction, but we can't think about it analytically because we haven't broken down fabric into these components. So with that in place, we can apply machine learning to look at patterns in fabrics and derive what stitch patterns, what stitch densities, and what yarns are used. So we can easily replicate a fabric, and then we
mm,
can, by organizing these definitions of fabrics into a large database, we can manage a mill's extensive fabric library. A lot of mills have 10,000 plus fabrics in their library. We can organize them, we can search them, and we can leverage and sell from the library instead of constantly doing new development. And color development takes a long time, but fabric development takes even longer because it's typically done on production machines instead of lab machines, which is expensive and it takes money out of the pocket of the mill. So it's taking a very logical approach to fabric and then taking known practices that have worked in other segments and implementing them.
yeah. I think that the alphabet was a great example. It's a great analogy. It's very simple. So fundamentally, you want to digitize the properties that go into constructing a fabric, whether it's color, the knit, or the repetition of the pattern. So it's easier to do different varieties is trial and error, and one does not have to go to the production line. Like you said, it can't be done in a lab. So it requires investment of time and money and resources every time something new has to be tried or constructed.
Right, and
Uh,
there's a couple of other attributes of fabric besides construction. Um, the way it feels. After color, hand feel is
mm,
probably the most important aesthetic attribute. And here people describe hand. Oh, it feels buttery, it feels luxurious. I don't know what those things mean. And then I put that into Google Translate because I'm dealing with mills around the world, and they're just scratching their heads saying, what are these people talking about? So there are ways to measure haptics or hand feel the same way that we measure color, build the same
mm,
model out, and then look at construction, look at the way it feels, look at test results as well, so we know about the performance of fabric, so that we know we can actually select fabrics based on our end use requirements
yeah.
not just our budget, and create really great garments.
So if I'm a designer or an apparel company, what does the process look like for me?
That's a great question because what we're talking about is a system that starts with the mill. Because the mill has the data, the mill has the fabric, the mill has to digitize their fabric and put it on the platform we call Arsenal. So in the initial beneficiary there is the mill because they can see what's in their library and they can market it. However, ultimately there's that's kind of a warehouse of data, and we want to turn the warehouse into a storefront. So if the mill can assign rights for a brand or a designer to search their library, but the problem is a designer is not going to search by knit, tuck, or miss, or stitch density. This kind of stuff is it's too far into the weeds. So we've used AI to derive what we call visual cues. And just like we use machine learning to figure out what the stitch types were, we've used it also to identify these visual cues. So it can analyze a fabric and say this fabric has vertical lines in it, it has horizontal lines, it has little square patterns, it has triangles. So from a designer's point of view, that's what there is. They understand aesthetics. They can search through this library using a very easy interface to find fabrics that meet their visual requirements, that also they can choose fabrics with certain hand feel properties, with certain performance properties, and obviously cost requirements as well. So it gives them a much better starting point where they can search a library from their own desktop without traveling halfway around the world. There'll still be some sampling, but when they request header cards of fabric, they'll be much more focused instead of just saying, send me 50 fabrics and I'll see if I like any of them. They'll actually be requesting fabrics that make a lot of sense.
This is very interesting, Keith. I was going to come down to questions on sustainability later, but you've already sort of touched on it briefly. We all know that fast fashion brands are like the thing, no matter, you might hate them, but that's what it is right now. And unfortunately, consumerism is going to continue to drive them. There are a lot of regulations which have come up in EU, some of them in the US. They're slowly coming to Asia as well. Do you think at some level this technology in some way can contribute into reducing the waste, eliminating some amount of waste, yet still or continue to offer a lot of variety to designers, brands, and consumers? And how is that happening or can happen?
Yeah, I think it's some tools like Arsenal and AI design are going to
Mhm.
be elements of a new process. Um, but it's going to be, when we look at sustainability and waste and issues like that, it's not that mills decide to overproduce and throw stuff out. A mill or a factory is going to produce the exact items that they get a purchase order for. The problem, it's not the mills and factories, they pursue operational excellence because that determines their profitability. The problem is brands don't. Brands their process of product development, since they're detached from their supply chain. They're working in New York or London or someplace. Factories are overseas, so they're detached from the problems that they generate. I was just talking to a brand yesterday, and here we are in the beginning of June. They're starting their spring summer 2027 design season. Now, that's 2 years out. Um, there's no way that you can forecast what customer demand will be like in 2 years. So they're developing a very wide group of products that over time they will edit out, they'll eliminate, or they'll add. So their line, when it actually comes to issuing POs in another year or so, will look different than it does today. And yet, all that development has taken place, and each development they do, whether it's fabric or garments, they're probably doing it at multiple suppliers. So they're wasting a lot of effort. We were talking to a mill the other day who said that of all the protos they develop for a particular brand, they get about a 1% hit rate as far as the brand actually adopting that style. So there's a ton of waste, and it's because um, brands have worked this way. You think about the term, the fashion season. Well,
Mhm.
when was the last time people bought clothes because the weather changed? Yeah, sure they do a little bit in the winter, but the driver of apparel purchases isn't the weather. It's what they see on social media, it's what they see in movies or whatever. So we need to get away from this model of these lengthy lines and this long development process and use the tools in place to in essence to mimic what the fast fashion companies are doing as far as speed of process, but just build a better grade of product than some of those guys are doing.
Yeah, yeah. I absolutely agree. And unfortunately, there's nothing that anyone is actively doing to reduce this waste. You just mentioned there's also a lot of financial inefficiency. There's no way you can predict what's going to happen 2 years from now, but I think that's just the way things are.
Well, just a quick example, we worked with a major global brand, and we looked at their PLM system. So we knew the fabrics they selected, the colors they selected, the mills that were creating the colors. And this was just, we were evaluating their color process. And the cost of their process, when you figured in the amount of courier fees and the development costs at mills and the salaries of people involved in this, um, just to get to a production approval before fabric was actually cut and sewn, they had wasted $8 million in color development processes. And that's very few people know about that because very few people are, look into the weeds to see what everything is done. So there may be a lot of clothes going to landfills and that kind of stuff, but I think that pales in comparison to the waste that occurs during development.
Yeah, that's huge. So, how would you encourage traditional companies to embrace digital transformation the way you are suggesting? And in what ways can this potentially improve collaboration among global teams also?
Well, I think that's a great question, and I think if we get down to the basics, a garment is constructed and colored fabric, and a fabric is constructed yarn, and yarn is constructed fiber. So if you think in just terms basic like that, and think of who your supply chain is and who produces what, and then when we develop colors, we need to know, are these colors actually achievable in these dyeing processes? When we develop fabrics, are the fabrics, will they meet our end use requirements and our cost requirements and our sustainability requirements? And when we develop garments, will they look good? Will people want them? And all of this can be modeled. We can model, I mean, we've modeled color for almost 100 years. We're beginning to model fabric, and there are companies like Shimaseki and Stoll that also have software that allow you to model fabric. And there's some new AI tools that allow you uh, to generate images. I would. There's been a trend over the past 20 years using 3D products to design garments. I think it's been a huge waste of time and money because the technology is kludgy and it's hard to work and it's not how designers work. And ultimately, it was meant to be used through the supply chain, but nobody uses it. The new technology, there's products like Newark or any number of AI products. You can very quickly see a super realistic version of what that design is going to be, and you can do iterations. And the goal of design is to get that product, adopted by so the brand actually sells it. And this is a quick way of doing that. And if you pair it with a good build spec or tech pack, then the factory can turn that around very quickly. So I think digitalization, as far as color, fabric, and garment, and tools that support that, are going to be the foundation of a new model.
Keith, you touched upon this briefly. Do you think this could also help in like hyper personalization for brands? You mentioned AI, and that's what I'm picking up from.
So there's let's take this a step further. We've talked about digitizing and using AI. The big surprises that people are learn is brands don't own the patterns or the build specs that the factories develop. Well, there's a couple brands that do, but for the vast majority of the brands don't own those specs. The factory does. So you think of a factory that's doing work for global brands. They probably have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of build specs for garments that they've produced in the past. And if you look at fashion over the past 10 years, not much has changed. I mean, polo shirts are still popular. Woven shirts are still popular. Pants haven't changed that much. So literally, I think what's going to happen is this. We talk about the industry is not vertically integrated. In other words, the brands don't own their supply chain. I think we're going to reintegrate, but the brands won't own the supply chain will own the brands. So you think about a factory or a vendor with all of these assets. If they can organize those assets so that they're searchable, and they can apply an AI agent to determine what's trending in what customers are buying, they can literally come up with a design, search their inventory of build specs that they've already built, pull one up that they know how to make, that they know all of the requirements for manufacturing, they know the ergonomics of the sewing line, all that kind of stuff, and they can literally go from concept to production in days. Because when you ask the factory, once you have your approvals and all this kind of stuff, how long does it take to produce your order? Well, they'll say, well, it's not that long. And so since they've shortened the cycle, they don't have to produce huge volumes of products. They can produce smaller lots and then just replenish using basically three factors. If a product is selling, keep making it. If it slows down, stop making it. And if you see a new product in the market, find something quickly and get it into production. It's almost like an open to buy model of retail, but it's really that simple.
But we just talked about the amount of energy, resources, and time that big brands are still continuing to waste when it's not even approved yet, when the technology to shorten the cycle and eliminate a lot of this waste is already in place.
Right.
It's just
Right.
about reading the right patterns and then only making what is absolutely selling. And you can
Right.
also then quickly adjust that as well, like you mentioned.
And here again, there's so much money wasted in the development process that if you eliminate that, you can actually build higher grade products, perhaps better fabric, more expensive fabric. You can produce it in regions where labor cost is higher, and your margin is still going to be the same, if not higher. Basically, you get rid of the waste and you
Yeah.
take it all to the bottom line.
Why do you think brands are still not doing this if this is such an easy answer?
Because they've always done it that way. And I mean, there is inertia is a scary thing because it's fashion is challenged right now because uh, sourcing is volatile. Um, Prices are, with tariffs are going up or down, and so they want to hang on and survive. And what we're basically saying is let go. And letting go is a scary thing. And I mean, I can tell you, it's not just changing the model in a huge way that's scary, but even when we developed the processes of getting rid of lab dips, we
Mm.
got a lot of resistance because people thought they were going to lose their jobs. I've been doing lab dips all my life. What am I going to do now? Well, what we found is you address a higher class of problem. Looking at lab dips in the light box is kind of mind numbing. I mean, yeah, you get good at it, but it's a wasted effort. However, when we implemented this process at Under Armour, the people in the color office became color analysts. So they started looking at how production was going, what colors were selling, so they could add more value to the company by applying their understanding of color in a business sense to drive more volume. And I think that's kind of scary. But the fact of the matter is, the scariest thing out there right now is AI is going to have a huge impact on everything. And so
Mhm.
either you get on board or you'll be very unhappy. So we derived the name of our company Black Swan from Nassim Taleb's theory of black
Yeah.
swan. And basically, black swan theory is the big changes in history haven't come from slow development. They've come from crazy, unexpected things. And there's three elements of black swan theory in the way we use it. You propose what is a crazy idea that people think, oh, that's nuts. You're not going to do that. You do it and it works. And then all of a sudden it becomes the new normal. And I think the challenge here is, in a sense, AI is a black swan event, but in another sense, AI is the opposite of a black swan event because AI is aggregated conventional wisdom and
Yeah.
aggregated thought processes. So you're
Yeah.
not going to get these crazy ideas out of conventional wisdom. So it's, in my career, who would have thought that somebody starting as a fashion illustrator would be working in factories around the world? It just doesn't make sense. But because I've had these crazy perspectives that aren't conventional wisdom, I've been able to see a couple of things that maybe somebody else didn't.
Rightly said. Actually, AI is the black swan event, but itself is built on, reading patterns.
Right.
So it's not doing anything different. So we're nearing the end of the podcast. I want to understand what is your current go-to-market plan? Which geographies are you targeting? How are you approaching brands and encouraging them to adopt digitization as you're supporting?
We're in a couple different ways. On one hand, when it comes to fabric, we're starting with the mills because here again, the mills have the data, and we have to convince the mills to collect and gather and organize the data in a certain way. And once we have a few mills in the system, then the next thing is to go to a vendor, a garment vendor, and garment vendors are like subcontractors for the brands. They are like contractors for the brands. They basically take the order and they find the mills and they find the factories and they basically deliver the goods. So it would make sense for a vendor to know what fabric is available at multiple mills. And then there are brands like Under Armour or Nike or Ralph Lauren who source their own fabric. So once we have enough data in the system, then we can go directly to the brands. That's fabric. We're also, when it comes to Gen AI and garment design, we're involved in that as well because here again, like we said, you design to produce. So if we have a better idea of what the desired garment is, then we can pair it with a mill and start looking for fabrics. And with fabrics, if a designer is actually looking at fabrics from a mill's fabric library, part of the problem right now is small designers have to deal with minimum order quantities, MOQs. So they can't really get the fabrics they want. They just use the fabrics that they can get. However, if they're working with a mill and looking into their system, there's the opportunity for them to select a fabric that's going into production for another customer add 100 yards on at no cost. So we get rid of MOQs. So we have to look at the entire picture, and the entire picture starts with design, gets into fabric, gets into color, gets into patterns, and ultimately, I think the future of apparel is um, factories owning the brands and small designers replacing big legacy designers because they have the creativity, they have knowledge of the market, and they're willing to take chances.
Well, you've already answered my last question. I was going to ask you, how do you predict the future of textile with all the technology? Before we go, any parting words that you would want to share with somebody who is in the field of textiles and working on some kind of innovations, please?
Well, I, you look at textiles apparel, it's roughly a $4 trillion industry when you factor in revenue from brands, from the supply chain, all the way down to the spinners. And it gets bigger every year. And everyone will always wear clothes. When when newspapers digitize, they cannibalize their sales of newspapers with online content. So they they kind of hurt themselves. Well, people will never, there may be the metaverse, but people will always wear physical clothes. So it's an industry that's going to be around. It's probably, of all industries out there, it has the lowest capability of maturity because in the past, we have, instead of solving technical problems, we basically offshored them to places where you could get around technical problems just by throwing cheap labor at it. That's changed. There's there's no cheap labor left, and if there is, then there are all kinds of other problems. So it's time that we take this opportunity. There are over 100,000 knitting mills in the world today. None of them have this technology. So even if we get 1% of those mills, that's a pretty big number. I mean, this is exponential growth versus just a little bit of sales increase each year. So I think it's a great industry to be in. And as we improve the processes, there's opportunities to not only make money, but to actually enjoy your work. Probably the best part of my job is meeting people around the world, like you, for instance, but not just online, but in sitting down in mills, talking to the people in the labs, talking to the sewers, talking to various people involved in industry, and we all share a lot in common.
Yep, yep. Those are good words to close the podcast with. Thank you, Keith, for this wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure that there was so much for everyone else who's listening. If you want to get in touch with Keith and have such wonderful conversations, I'm going to leave his LinkedIn details in the box below, and you can reach out to him. And if you want to like more such podcasts and more such content, please follow us and please subscribe to us. Thank you so much for listening in.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Keith, for your time.
Yep.